Do you think this kind of thing is a direct response to what Trump has done? I mean,
Don't you? I do.
Yes, I mean,
totally.
But do you think he's in a way done? He's done. I mean, because we think about the tariffs as being sort of a blow to China, but in a way, he's boosted Chinese prestige enormously.
Chinese prestige, but he's also boosted the sense which the Chinese and the Russians rightly have that the rest of the world are all against them.
Now, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there, except for when they don't, because this time every Tuesday I'm joined by Ian Wilson for our regular feature, If Only We'd Known, explaining why actually the present rather closely resembles the past. And today we're going to look at the history which predated the anti-West alliance, which President Xi hopes he will establish in his summit with Vladimir Putin in that conference that is going on at the moment. And Ian Wilson is with me right now. Hello.
Hi, Hugo.
Thank you very much for being with us. So look,
Lovely
we've had this big summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which has been going on the last couple of days. How does this play into the sort of long-standing relationship that Xi has with non-Western countries?
What Xi Jinping has asked everybody at that conference to do is to go back to 1945 and see the way that the attendants at this conference, particularly the Russians and the Indians and the Chinese themselves, view that date, because obviously the West regards 1945 as the moment when America and Britain, plucky little Dad's Army Britain standing alone against the rest of Europe, liberated the world. Mm-hmm. Whereas I think what the Russians would like us to remember is that it was actually the Red Army that defeated Hitler.
Yep.
They'd also, as a PS, like us to remember that all over Western Ukraine there were posters from 1940 onwards, before the Germans actually occupied, of Hitler, saying Hitler the liberator, regarding Hitler as the great liberator from the Russian tyranny. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, in other words, the way everybody on this planet regards history is tremendously arbitrary, and I think it's absolutely fascinating what's going on in Beijing at the moment, that Xi Jinping, arguably the most powerful man in the world, is reminding us of what they think, particularly those three leaders, what they think 1945 is. For them, the Chinese, it was a moment to look back when 30 million Chinese people were killed by the Japanese. I mean, that's about half. That's about half the numbers of the entire European and American population who were killed by the Second World War, including the 6 million massacred Jews. So, I mean, it's an incredible thing to look back on. The Indians, who'd been forced to fight for the British Empire, knew that they could eventually very, very quickly become rid of the British. That's the thing that Narendra Modi and the Indians are looking back to in 1945. And the Russians quite rightly regard it as the moment of triumph for Russia, because Churchill, as you know, who said we must go to war in 1939 to defend Poland, handed it to Stalin on a plate at Yalta.
I mean, so look, the Western perspective here would be that although Russia did defeat the Nazis, Russia was also instrumental in starting the Second World War, which I know in Russia they consider that to be a different war, but nonetheless it wasn't.
It was, yes, definitely.
From their perspective, it was definitely a different war. But also I think we generally look at it in the West as being, although China and Russia joined with the West to liberate the world in the Second World War, what followed was not exactly an exercise in liberation. The Soviet Union was not free, that China was not and remains unfree, and so on. How does that kind of perspective land over there?
Well, I mean, of course, as far as liberal-minded, decent-minded people are concerned, the imprisonment, literal imprisonment in many cases, of the people of China and the entire population of Eastern Europe as a result of 1945 is a catastrophe. And we're still living with all the consequences of that. But nonetheless, I'm not saying that what they're saying in Beijing today and tomorrow with their great victory parades are good things. I'm just saying they're a good wake-up call to us to realize that the way we think of history is very, very different from the way they think of history.
Well, so Vladimir Putin at the summit, he said, we see that in certain Western states, the results of the Second World War are de facto revised and the verdicts of the Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals are openly disregarded. Yeah. What does he mean?
Well, I think he means what we've been talking about. As far as Russia is concerned, although, of course, we had the Cold War as our only way of, because they couldn't, psychologically speaking, have an actual war against Stalin after what he'd done at Yalta. In spite of that fact, old Enoch Powell used to say regularly in the House of Commons, we should never forget it was the Red Army that won this war.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, so from China's perspective, what was China's role in World War II? I know, yeah, as you said, 30 million people were killed, but what kind of role did they play in the fighting?
They'd been beaten up by the British in the 19th century. They'd been exploited by the extremely powerful Japanese Empire during the entire 1930s, and they were girding themselves up for a huge civil war, which eventually, as we all know, was going to lead to the victory of the Chinese Communist Party. And Mao Zedong, as I still call him, but you meant to pronounce him differently now, winning. And in 1949, this, in a way, dreadful regime being set up. But although we call it a dreadful regime, in many other ways, just as Putin's Russian Federation, awful as it is in many ways a throwback to the old idea that these vast countries with their tyrannical governments are worth taking seriously. And in case of China, not so much in case of Russia, the economy, in spite of all the Trump sanctions and tariffs, is going to beat us.
And look, from a Russian perspective, when we remember the Nazis in the West, we think about their racism and their views of racial superiority. I guess we sort of forget that an important feature. We tend to forget that an important feature of that racism was a sort of an anti-Slavic thing. Presumably, they haven't forgotten that in Russia.
They have not forgotten it, and of course, the very word Slav and slave are the same, semantically speaking, in most of the European languages. And Hitler used to say that he regarded Russia as Germany's India. I mean, the comparison being with the way the British had behaved in India, which is utterly disgraceful, in my opinion, as that of most liberal-minded people nowadays. So, I mean, it is an extraordinary legacy that it's very hard if you're not Russian or not from the east of Europe to get into our heads, because we tend to think Hitler is the ultimate evil. Obviously, he was totally evil. And as you say, we tend to think that the racism of the Nazis was all directed against black people, Jews, and so on. The worst racism, in a sense, leading to the Second World War, under which all these other horrors took place, was the anti-Slavic belief.
And look, finally, you mentioned India. Well, how does India remember 1945?
I think it remembers it as the time when they were getting ready to be free at last. Yeah, don't forget, again, I mean, we think of the British Raj as a very harmless thing. The British did in India things which are like what Putin is doing in Ukraine at the moment. It marched in, it took other people's property, and it killed millions of Indians.
So look, I mean, should we be worried by this? Should we look at this and see this is like the ingredients for a third world war, that you have a bloc forming over there in direct opposition to a bloc that exists over here?
I don't know about worried, but you should either be totally frightened and terrified, or you should just recognise, which I don't think Mr. Trump, he doesn't listen to this programme often enough probably, but I mean,
not nearly often enough, I've heard. Yeah,
I just suspect that he doesn't have any idea about the kind of historical stuff we're talking about, and the Chinese and the Russians are running rings around Trump at the moment.
Do you think this kind of thing is a direct response to what Trump has done? I mean,
Don't you? I do.
Yes, I mean,
totally.
But do you think he's in a way done? He's done. I mean, because we think about the tariffs as being sort of a blow to China, but in a way he's boosted Chinese prestige enormously.
Chinese prestige, but he's also boosted the sense which the Chinese and the Russians rightly have that the rest of the world are all against them, and there's nothing like stirring national morale. For feeling, look at England in 1940 when the whole of Europe was against us. We were at our best.
Wow. Ian Wilson, thank you very much indeed. Always good to have you here, always an education.